Hey there everyone! This video is part 2 of an essay entitled Libertarianism in Decay, as you've probably gathered by the title of this video. Being that this series is one entire essay, it would probably be beneficial to watch the first part before watching the following video, since most of the context and some important substance of the arguments presented here were covered in the previous video, and it may be difficult to understand what is being intended without having actually seen it. So a link to part 1 will be located in the description. Anyway. Hello there everyone! So we've identified the origins of libertarian philosophy, how this actually translates into political affiliation, or in this case the lack thereof, the various implications of how mainstream libertarian figures message to people of other political affiliations in contrast with how libertarian principles at their root fare in comparison, how the state influences the way in which people formulate their perceptions of their own interests, and the narratives which build these worldviews, along with the various advantages libertarian philosophy and libertarianism has over all other political affiliations, and exactly why no other political affiliations have the appeal or explanatory power which libertarianism at its core does, which to briefly go over once more for those who didn't watch part 1, despite the disclaimer in the introduction. So, in 1789, during the later years of the period which is now commonly referred to as the Scientific Enlightenment, a man by the name of William Belsham wrote an essay which was titled On Liberty and Necessity. In this essay, which was regarding the subject of free will versus necessarianism, a long-dead philosophy which was basically a theologian argument for determinism, Belsham uses the term libertarian to describe the argument for free will in contrast with necessarianism. A little over a decade later, in 1802, a poem published in the British Critic by the author of Gebir first coined the term libertarian in its application to politics on page 432, referring to an individualist philosophy which rejects all general forms of political rule. So, libertarian first principles describe an individualist philosophy which rejects any description of morality conceptualizing laws around group interests at the expense of individual agency, which rejects all claims of possible legitimate political rule, and comes to these conclusions from the premise that all moral agents are necessarily entitled to the full products of their agency, and that there is no consistent argument another moral agent could present which would justify attempting to declare dominion over separate moral agents. The key to understanding exactly how one can best advertise and message their political beliefs to people who don't understand or don't agree is a topic which has long since been debated, but despite this is incredibly simple and well understood by mainstream political organizations, governments, or interest groups. And unsurprisingly, it is completely divorced from how most people are introduced to it through government education, civics, or the mainstream media. The government is a monopoly on arbitration, by which I mean it fundamentally at its core is an arbitration firm which uses coercion to suppress other arbiters who are independent and competitive from it in order for the state actors to be able to arbitrarily impose their will onto non-state actors on a systemic and consistent basis. This is why victimless actions can be considered a crime even though by definition there's no victim. So there's no realistic basis for someone engaging in this action to be considered a criminal, and people who have actually victimized others can never be held responsible for their actions if the state deems it to be in their interests for that not to be the case. This is an uncontroversial fact, and most people throw around the terms rule of law or law of the land casually and don't even realize the implications of the system or what it even is that they're defending. This realization, aside from the aforementioned problems, creates two very interesting conclusions with some very serious political implications. Firstly, that all states, state firms, and organizations founded by states are laboring under a single set of hegemonic interests. These interests being to collect as much revenue as possible for the state, and to maintain a stable and friendly social order which allows the state to continue ruling with as little resistance from non-state actors as possible. Because the state as a parasitic firm fundamentally functions under a model which necessitates exponential growth, more specifically because governments are incapable of producing new resources. They're dependent on the production and speculation on the part of non-state actors. And as more industries, along with resources and producers, enter the market, the state requires more resources to be spent on collecting these resources and keeping these producers from trading around the state or creating new innovations which harm the state's interests. Any and all state services will therefore necessarily function with a different set of interests than the interest of non-state actors, since the function of a government is to operate in a manner which is necessarily at the direct expense of non-state actors, both in their premise and revealed preferences, as is the case for any organization which is incapable of production and requires parasitism to obtain revenue. And this can be demonstrated fairly easily by just about every monopolized service by the state, in contrast with what purpose these firms are intended to fill in the perspective of non-state actors to their interests. For instance, the interest of people who don't have any vested interests in ruling through the government or sustaining the government through its various organizations and firms, enrolling their children into education, are doing so with their perceived interest being that their children should develop skills which will help them navigate and find a comfortable, prosperous career path, and learn how to think critically, and develop the ability to formulate their own perception of the world so that they can better conceive of what their own interests are. Well, being that the government needs to have a decently expansive influence over how people associate in any society that it rules over in order to ensure that it can consistently collect revenue with as little expense as possible, and so that people have a more difficult time creating ways to undermine the state, and as previously noted, it's in the state's interest to have a population which doesn't perceive it to be a threat to very many of their own interests. So they teach children how to think and what to think within narrative structures designed to benefit the interests of the state, and it's on record stated by the designers of the model of the education system most modern governments utilize, known colloquially as the Prussian model, that this is the case. Now, the main political implication of this observation is that there exists a natural and necessary antagonism between the interests of state actors, any and all people or organizations operated or established by the government, and non-state actors, any and all people or organizations who are not in any way affiliated with the government. With all of these major advantages which libertarianism is able to exercise over every other political allegiance, even in a state society in terms of potential appeal, you may be asking yourself why it was even possible in the first place for libertarianism as it was originally espoused to be largely forgotten until recently to the back pages of history in the first place. Well, we know exactly how this was done, but why did it ever work to begin with? Why didn't libertarians recognize what was happening from a mile away? Well, this in part can indeed be blamed on malicious infiltrators such as the Koch brothers influencing political strategy within the Libertarian Party, among others, but the fact of the matter is that the Libertarian Party existed in the first place in order for this to happen, and the acceptance of partyarchy and the idea of working within the system were endorsed by many of the bigger contemporary libertarian philosophers philosophers at the time, most notably Murray Rothbard himself. However, there is more explanatory power, I would argue, behind the idea that the sorry state of libertarianism is due mostly to mismanagement within political organizations, specifically internal problems with messaging their ideas along with how libertarians approach non-libertarians. So we'll start off with messaging, since you really can't properly manage any organization trying to push subversive counter-narratives in the first place if you are utterly unable to actually convey counter-narratives to begin with, which is more or less the biggest issue with libertarian messaging at the moment. The most popular libertarian strategy as it pertains to messaging, as noted earlier, is to treat libertarianism not as if it's a separate philosophy which, when applied, consistently creates a fundamentally different kind of political allegiance than any statist philosophy could, since it starts from a fundamentally contrary internal framework to the assertions made about the state and its incentive structures along with how it affects society, but as if it's a set of ideas which complement other political allegiances that operate within internal narrative structures that are fundamentally inconsistent with libertarian philosophy. This creates a major problem with libertarianism in its application to politics, being based on a philosophy which is dependent on the ability to effectively establish a counter-narrative in order to appeal to its target demographic. It simply has no means of doing so because of the previously noted problem along with its implications. And the most shameful part is that there naturally is a counter-narrative established within libertarian philosophy at its roots. In fact, a counter-narrative for pretty much every narrative the state attempts to establish. This, of course, being mainly that political rule is inherently antagonistic towards the interests of every single moral agent, and therefore it best suits the non-state actors' interests to subvert the state, along with the best way of each individual to achieve their own material interests being to engage in productive associations with other mutually benefiting parties. And the only way that can be done is by getting rid of the state, because the state, in order to secure its interests, creates artificial scarcity along with state-secured legal privilege, and therefore limits on the amount of resources produced along with their availability within legal markets to only a handful of politically favored producers. It requires more effort to go through the cognitive dissonance needed to justify libertarianism under the status quo narrative structure established by state media, politicians, and the education system, which is that the state exists to function in the interest of the people whom it rules over. But on the same token, I believe that for the misguided mass of libertarians who find value in attempting to ally with non-libertarian political affiliations, this is not a malicious attempt to subvert the political application of their philosophical values. Rather, I believe largely that this is a result of the failure of libertarian political organizations to properly put forward a cohesive counter-narrative to that of the states, and consequently, many libertarians develop a false idea of what libertarianism even is, or simply are unable to grasp the concept of the true implications of an anti-political affiliation like libertarianism appealing to the interest of every person simultaneously, because a libertarian society is absent a coercive monopoly on arbitration, which would use violence to socially engineer human behavior in a way where everyone is being disadvantaged, but the state can create economic policy plans which superficially appear to lessen the burden of the state on one set of marginal preferences at the perceived expense of another. If you're unable to establish a counter-narrative with any sort of continuity for a political affiliation which necessitates establishing one in order to deconstruct a master narrative being widely propagated by an organization which has the ability to systemically force it upon people while they're children so as to make them literally incapable of otherwise seeing your point of view, because not only their conception of the world but their conception of what shapes world events is the result result of a lie pushed to meet the interests of their political rulers, then libertarianism in its philosophy can never establish a foothold in mainstream society to any meaningful degree. So the basic priority for any and all libertarian messaging, therefore, is to ensure that the state's master narratives can be subverted. This is both to avoid the problems of and reap the benefits of the points of utility which libertarian philosophy innately affords libertarianism's messaging, elaborated on in the previous video along with earlier in this video. This is vital because if the master narrative put forward by the state is not subverted, then people will be conceptually incapable of even thinking that the state can't function in their interests. It's been long documented that states can't rule over a population with might alone, from philosophers ranging from our favorite Austro and pre-Austro libertarians all the way to mid-Enlightenment thinkers such as David Hume, because the population which states rule over vastly outnumber the state actors in the society, so every state needs to engage in some form of systemic propagandizing of their population to ensure that the population sees the state not only as functioning in their interests, but as a manifestation of their interests. Literally, in this worldview promoted by government civics, children are taught that they are the government, and whether or not they realize it or the outcome, the government is functioning in their interests by giving them rights, which they also naturally have simultaneously. In fact, most of you watching this video probably believed this for a significant portion of your life, or at the very least remember being taught this. It's important to destroy this narrative because aside from being provably untrue and doesn't really even in fact work in premise, if the foundation of how someone processes any information is rooted from a premise which is fundamentally opposed to the one which libertarianism is based around, they will literally be incapable of ever even potentially arriving at the same conclusion, because they will be incapable of internalizing the information in a way which suggests that the state is opposed to their interests. They'll either interpret information in a way which conforms to what's been beaten in their heads all their lives, which will undermine your attempt at messaging, or they'll engage in cognitive dissonance to try and justify both acknowledging the facts you present while also rationalizing it within their worldview in a way which allows them to mitigate or ignore the anti-state implications. A great example of which would be the deep state or money in politics narratives, which you'll notice are both promoted widely by state media outlets. Now, of course, the fact alone that these narratives have become mainstream signifies that a major portion of the population has become disillusioned with the state, which is why in the last few years OG 19th century individualist anarchism and Austro-libertarianism have incidentally seen a spike in popularity and likely won't be going away anytime soon if any trends are an indicator. And this leads me to how exactly libertarians should go about establishing their counter-narrative in the first place, which leads me to my second point, the model and ways in which libertarians should organize. Now, it should go without saying, but in a socio-political order where the general perception of personal interest is built upon a master narrative, which can only exist if people see philosophy interchangeably with material interests, and are systemically indoctrinated into seeing their material interests as being interchangeable with those of the states, messaging by appealing to personal interest is a top priority. This is the reason why taxation is theft, for example, is by far the most popular and effective libertarian political slogan. It's not preachy, directly to the point, it doesn't try to obscure its message behind any sort of euphemism which grants the appearance of it being sort of self-explanatory regardless of the starting premise that makes up your worldview. It establishes the counter-narrative of the state being antagonistic towards the interests of those it rules over, but most importantly, it overtly appeals to material interest. And what libertarians don't really seem to understand is why exactly this particular message is so effective, or who it appeals to, and most importantly, how exactly to appeal to people. Well, we've already covered point 1 and 3 earlier, but another important point which libertarians regularly miss in their messaging is the realization that framing information differently yields different results depending on the audience. Now, it's understandable why this approach is rather obscure and has only really been expanded upon in a very marginal amount of material, because anti-political allegiances are the only ones capable of utilizing this strategy effectively, because they're the only political allegiances which can consistently appeal to the interests of every marginal preference simultaneously and yield benefits as a result of doing so as a foundational premise of their philosophy, and is not necessarily dependent on the proposition of some sort of legislative policy needing to exist. So really, the approach libertarians need to be taking is dependent on their audience and the marginal preferences associated with their particular political allegiances. Libertarians largely since the early 20th century have gone from being a group of basically counter-economists whose foundational philosophy was based on an individualist critique of all political rule, and a practical narrative being based around that it made people poorer through limiting the available means by which they could obtain resources, by creating artificial scarcity, and through various finance restrictions, coercive restrictions on who could legally associate and how, licensing laws, taxation, and etc. But also emphasizing this phenomena and how it's created a dysgenic effect regarding how businesses conduct themselves, because by creating artificial scarcity and arbitrarily increasing living costs, only a select handful of politically favored producers are able to produce, which in turn allows them to largely operate independently from actual competitive market standards, because these state-secured legal privileges allow them to externalize losses and gain a greater market share within their respective industries than they would otherwise be able to do with the abundance of resources without state restrictions, and diseconomy of scale created by businesses mismanaging resources internally when they scale too large, to an affiliation which has had its core philosophy castrated by a bunch of conservatives and malicious political interests who went out of their way to associate their beliefs and positions with libertarianism in order to obscure the original philosophy and messaging through the process of co-optation. This is one of the main points which allowed 19th century libertarians to have the various successes which they managed to obtain through subverting state influence and challenging the socio-political order which existed, because libertarians back then very much understood that exactly what happened as a result of libertarians trying to ally themselves with other political allegiances would happen, and they largely understood the true intellectual depth and potential of their own purported philosophy. Libertarians today fail to recognize how to appeal to other political affiliations, because the modern political strategy for libertarians has become completely divorced from their original philosophical principles, which concluded with appealing to the material interests of every single person. More specifically, libertarians don't recognize what political affiliations in a state society are. As a result, libertarians have adopted the strategy of messaging libertarian political parties operating around the state's interest and master narratives views, which for reasons elaborated upon earlier is going to create a toothless political movement incapable of having its message reach an audience. And this is also the reason why libertarianism has only affiliated with a few specific political positions on a part of the state-constructed political spectrum, from over the last 50 years or so, and most libertarians message specifically to these affiliations, the more colloquially conservative types, and vociferously attack the interests of their political opponents to pander to these groups. And the reason why this is the case is incredibly evident when you examine the popular and somewhat intact actual libertarian messaging which did survive since the 19th century. The slogan of taxation is theft being a prime example. Most people who consider themselves to be conservative or within that general area of statist political allegiance are people with lower time preferences, i.e. they derive more value of having more resources and being able to utilize them over spare time. They're the kind of person who would prefer to work overtime even if without it they'd be more than able to pay their bills, whereas the so-called lefty progressive types tend to have much higher time preferences, which obviously is just the inverse of low time preference. The slogan in question appeals moderately to people of higher time preferences if they recognize Say's law, which most of them don't, so it falls flat. But it consistently appeals to affiliations associated with lower time preferences, and as a result, many libertarians make the mistake of allying with political affiliations that appeal specifically to these marginal preferences within the narrative structures and relative framework of the master narrative promoted by the state, because many libertarians start from the false premise which makes up the statist worldview, that ideologies and ideas themselves carry some sort of objective standard to them, and strategize as if the political party strategy is the only way to appeal to people, and by either ignoring the fact that the proposed conclusion of how the party strategy is supposed to achieve political change doesn't stand up to scrutiny even in premise, with game theory, there being no evidence that voting has or can affect the outcomes of what states write in their legislation, or the fact that all state actors operate around hegemonic interests, and in fact itself implicitly contradicts some of the narratives created by the libertarian philosophy's premise. And this lack of narrative-based deconstructionism, aside from and simultaneously because of the aforementioned problems, has also led to an issue within libertarian political organization where successful individual arguments and lines of rhetoric in messaging have been misinterpreted as the success for the current strategy of organization, which comes back to the necessity of allowing for the creation of a cohesive counter-narrative and operating around said counter-narratives because of problems like this, which could be mitigated. Now, the most demonstrably effective means of politically organizing, which both subverts the state's master narrative but also the state's ability in general to continue functioning by undermining its ability to sustain itself through creating subversive networks and commodities, also referred to as agorism or counter-economics, because this form of direct action is materially profitable, which incentivizes everyone to engage in it, but also simultaneously by mere action drives home the ideal messages which libertarians should be conveying in order to construct a counter-narrative and lead people towards becoming skeptical of political rule as a concept. And it would also singly undermine every single aforementioned issue so far in how libertarians organize politically and message. This is a subject which I regularly go on about here on this channel, as I would argue that this strategy is fundamentally the key to mainstreaming libertarianism. The reason I mention this, however, is that this has several benefits over messaging through appealing to ideology and debate, even in concept, as libertarians currently approach these conceptions of the world. Firstly, when debating, there are so many different marginal preferences along with pieces of context which could be forming the worldview which people formulate their perceptions of their own interest with, that you can never fully deconstruct the state narrative with 100% success through debate, only to a generalization, and because the narrative structures which the state creates operate around a hegemonic interest which can be identified with counter-economics, it will work with 100% certainty as an appeal over any other because it directly provides material incentive as well as implying the validity of a counter-narrative against the state inherently by functioning antagonistically towards the state's interests. Secondly, there's cost associated with advertising and messaging ideologically, resources, time, psychic profits, etc., without even a guarantee that you would convince the other person that what you're telling them is in their interests. Whereas with counter-economics, by definition, this can only function at a material gain for every party involved, since counter-economic producers require mutually beneficial and profitable exchanges to occur in order to be effective in the first place. But finally, what brings us to the main point where I think libertarians go wrong in the first place in terms of how to message their position. This is most common in that even libertarians who reject partyarchy in their messaging regularly do this. This is more of a problem with the flow of libertarian arguments, which is that libertarians tend to get stuck on the ethics of liberty and neglect or even go as far as to actively make the case against practical argumentation. In the case of someone like Larkin Rose or Stefan Molyneux. Well, Stefan Molyneux back when he was somewhat libertarian-minded, for instance. There are multiple problems with this approach. Firstly, as noted previously, how people within the state-constructed framework of the world are incentivized to see political affiliations within a state society operate as a hybrid between philosophy and material interest. Therefore, any approach to political debate or messaging which rejects material interest will be rejected by the person you're attempting to message to. This is evidenced by when statists perplexingly respond to libertarian ethical arguments by trying to deflect with advertising their ideals behind an appeal to pragmatism. If you want a great example of this sort of exchange, the debate which took place in August of last year between Larkin Rose and Lauren Southern is essentially just a several hour-long embodiment of every response to any statist has responded to a libertarian, while the libertarian in question refuses to make practical cases for their position. And there's really no excuse for this either, because libertarianism itself conveys many arguments against authoritarianism simply in its philosophical roots, being more practical and necessary, as I mentioned earlier, on top of political rulers not having any legitimate claim of ownership over other moral agents, nor being able to demonstrate any even in premise. Just simply say to yourself what statism actually argues and tell me whether or not this sounds like an efficient way to organize. One central monopoly on arbitration uses force to meet the interests of hundreds of millions of people who all have interests disconnected from those of the people controlling the state. No, obviously states can't and don't function in the interests of the people they rule over, even in premise. That's patently absurd. So this last point, I think, really is more just a consequence of intellectual laziness, but to be fair, the framing in which many statist questions operate around is designed to poison the well by presupposing their own assumptions about human incentives in the conclusion of their arguments, and will baselessly assert as a normative assumption that there would only be one model of organization for any specific firm within a freed market anarchy, or that only one thing could happen if the state wasn't involved. For example, many statists who argue against anarchy will argue that security firms would be ineffective in the said society because there'd be no way to contract with them consistently. And you can't have a society where one person pays for a service everyone uses, because that takes away the incentive for other people to get their own and promotes parasitism. Which is exactly why most people wouldn't contract with security firms through a subscription model. Some people in some situations or marginal preferences may see subscription-based security firms as being beneficial, but most people wouldn't for exactly the reason this argument highlights. Consequently, most people providing security services in a libertarian society would probably accept direct payments along with other more common means of preferred payment, e.g. mutual aid. Why is it that statists assume in their premise that in a society where all association can only happen if every party in the association mutually benefits, that every single person exchanging goods would only associate in, by default, the least efficient and most costly ways? Well, because it makes it easier to argue against, of course, and also deflects attention away from the fact that this is actually a problem inherent to state societies and not anarchies. And many libertarians get tripped up in arguments like this because they don't realize that the conclusion of the statist position is circular and presupposes its own premise to be true without providing a reason to support it. And it doesn't help matters that mainstream libertarianism operates around largely the same presuppositions that statists do in regards to the concept of an economic system being inherent to any sort of society. As a result, many libertarians incorrectly assess that appealing to pragmatism is itself some sort of fallacy, when in reality this tactic unwittingly exposes the greatest weakness of statism and the greatest strength behind libertarian philosophy when applied to politics. Libertarianism is the only political allegiance which isn't inherently affected by the implied merger between philosophy and material interests, which is inherent within the presupposition of a legislation-based economic system, since libertarianism in premise seeks to achieve its ends through subversion rather than within the state apparatus, and are in fact opposed to the mere concept of doing so. Therefore, libertarians are able to conceptualize and work with arguments which no other political affiliation could. For example, in response to a statist making the aforementioned argument regarding security firms, a good libertarian counterargument is not to completely reject the pragmatic argument like most tend to do and try to steer the conversation back to ethical argumentation, rather to point out how exactly the libertarian society is capable of creating the said resource, because every association in a libertarian society is based around mutual self-interest directly between human actors who desire the product or service in question, and therefore a libertarian society would appeal to everyone's interests simultaneously. So actually, not only is a libertarian society capable of providing services like security, but it's the only kind of society where such a service can exist in a manner where within every circumstance it is available and benefits everyone. That's not even to mention how more people would have more resources, or how because these services aren't dependent on state cartelization or coercive subsidy, they actually can be held accountable and have an incentive to serve people. Then you can easily spin this argument around back on the statist. For instance, how exactly is a model of organization which coerces you to fund it going to function in your interests? Or how is a single model of organization run by a single firm even getting past the observable disconnect between their stated interests and their operative interests going to function in the interest of every single person, when each individual person has their own set of marginal preferences which are going to vary from one another? And there are many circumstances where services operating around this model would be structurally incapable of providing services to some people. Say, for example, a farmer living in a small farming block 20 miles outside of the nearest town has their home burglarized and they don't have any weapons to defend themselves. How is the state's police going to help him out? Seems like in his situation that it would be much more beneficial to create contracts with one of his neighbors who does have a gun or is in connection with someone who has one to protect his property in exchange for some of his produce. But yes, the libertarian response to pragmatic appeals from statists really shouldn't be, if slavery was efficient, I would still reject it. It should be, I reject slavery because on top of being impossible to ethically justify, there was never even an argument for its efficiency in the first place, and the whole industry had to be propped up by state cartelization throughout most of history, so to speak. Because statists' attempts at justification by pragmatic appeal appeal are even weaker, arguably, than their ethical arguments in its favor. If anything, libertarians should specifically make it a point to emphasize how the state functions antagonistically towards the interests of the people it rules over, and innately makes it more difficult for the people it rules over to meet their own interests. Go on to point out how there are still state-sponsored slave trades today in states which operate around more innately expansive economic models. Really just hammer home the point that one of the last things the state has to sell itself on is its efficiency, how it appeals to the people it rules over, or its ability to organize better than individuals using their own resources, working towards their own interests. If it doesn't have demand, it has no place in a free society, and if it has demand, it doesn't require a state to exist. Now, pragmatic arguments are important, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The problem with going full consequentialist is that this position has no ability to construct a grand narrative or establish a social order. As such, it loses any ability to create pragmatic appeal because there's no cohesion in how people interpret their interests relative to others without an a priori frame of reference, and therefore you can't make an appeal to self-interest because self-interest doesn't mean anything without any sort of broader context, and a broader context could only come into being in a society without a state because of descriptive natural law. An anarchistic social order necessarily leads actors within it towards consistency and stability out of their own self-reliant pursuit of their interests. Therefore, most will take up arms to defend themselves along with establishing connections which allow them to do so, and arbitration/social order would be largely shaped around natural law, given that natural law is the most consistent application of ethics. We know that this is the case because human interest along with social views are largely shaped around environment and how the individual perceives their position in relation to the environment, since most neural networks in the brain are heavily influenced by perception of the world around the individual in question. This is a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity for anyone who's interested in researching this for themselves. Natural law arguments aren't a normative view, as most consequentialists like to straw man the position to make it sound. This being important because if natural law arguments were normative, they would have to equate ethical observations with moral necessity, which can't be demonstrated with any sort of consistency. This is why they're a descriptive observation, and rather ironically, it's actually the consequentialist perspective which is dependent on making a fallacious connection between an is and an ought, as they fail to recognize that information does not mean anything unless it's contextualized by an a priori reference and put into a demonstrable framework by a narrative structure which can be observed through logic, and the reasoning of which could be scrutinized, therefore asserting that information alone in is sufficient to create an objective framework that allows observers to make a universal truth claim in ought. So, I would argue that because pragmatic arguments against the state naturally come from the philosophical premise of libertarianism, I would assert that the dichotomy between pragmatism and ethical argumentation in regards to political messaging is false. However, in explicitly ethical arguments, libertarians also can attack statism pretty systematically, which is why most statists desperately try to avoid ethical arguments with libertarians. In conclusion to my final point, stop relying exclusively on ethical arguments if you want to get anywhere with convincing people of your position, because frankly, the statist internal worldview already for the most part operates around the notion that ethics exist merely as a tool to moral fag about whenever they want to get their way, since the normative function of any government is might makes right. Therefore, appealing on ethical arguments alone is never going to accomplish anything, and since the vast majority of actual principled libertarian argumentation which currently exists is centered around ethical appeals with no attempts to make practical arguments or counter-narratives, this is quite the problem. Anyway, that's all for part 2. Really, I was going to make an episode about strategizing an effective political organization in contrast with other ideas within conventional libertarian mainstream politics. However, I think that I may have already covered so much in this episode that there may not be a need for a part 3. Besides, each one of these episodes take me weeks to write because their length is frankly pretty debilitating. So comment as to whether or not you'd like to see another part, and I'll mull over whether or not a third part is even really necessary. Thank you all for watching. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.